I'm Ann Collins. I'm the publisher of Random House Canada, and I'm also the lucky person who gets to work with James FitzGerald. Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure I've ever been at a book launch quite like this one, where, first of all, I've never been to the Argonaut rowing club. I feel a little bit like we're in the middle of a family wedding. And maybe that's actually really, really true. But I'm really delighted to be here with James and with George Orr to talk about this incredible book. I also want to just call out Ben McNally over there, who you've already been keeping really, really busy. Thank you very much. The best bookseller. Am I allowed to say that you're the best bookseller? Anyway. I also want to call out Katie, my lord. This woman even made a flower arrangement that matched the cover of the book. I want to call out Claire, the publicist, who's been working her ass off. There you are. Yeah. And, okay, so I'm going to put my glasses on because I'm worried I'm going to forget what I want to say if I don't actually look at my script. So, all right, James. So I've been a small part of James's life project for almost 20 years now. I know no other writer with a mission like his, which is to dig into the lies and secrets and truths of his class and his times and his own family, relentlessly, doggedly, brilliantly, as the critical reception of his award-winning What Disturbs Our Blood, A Son's Quest to Redeem the Past, attests. And his first book, an oral history of Upper Canada College called Old Boys, was so revelatory, it led to the eventual criminal conviction of 3 former teachers for sexual abuse. But it also was an invitation to the buttoned-up elite to really talk, and amazing how freeing that turned out to be. I've already mentioned his second book, What Disturbs Our Blood. In that one, James turned his remarkable tenacity and investigator's instincts on his own family. In the process, restoring the reputation of his grandfather, a true medical pioneer, but also breaking a destructive family pattern that freed him of weighty family secrets in a breathtaking manner. And just by the by, it also argued for talk therapy and truth-telling and not masking drug regimens as the best kind of treatment to break the hold of certain mental illnesses. So now, 8 years after we published that book, James has been digging again in a very different sort of way. And I'm so happy he's here with us to talk about his new book, Dreaming Sally, a true story of first love, sudden death, and long shadows. Now, beyond James, in that incredibly snazzy jacket, is George Orr, who I truly think I know.
This is a very strange relationship.
This is a very strange thing going on here. Okay, so if you have the book in your hands and flip it over, there you will see the very young George Orr standing handsomely beside Sally, the Sally of the title, who 50 years ago was his fiancée. James didn't know George at the time the picture was taken, but I probably wouldn't want to have known George. But George's early life and James's ran on very similar tracks. Both went to UCC, though George was a couple years ahead, I think.
3.
Yeah, both were sons of old boys who had seen combat as naval officers in the Second World War. Their mothers were both old girls who had gone to the same private school in Toronto, and much was expected of both young men, especially by their mothers. Except I think that the expectations heaped on George were even higher than those loaded onto James, in that as a boy, as James writes, George was told that nothing short of the Prime Minister's office would do. So George, whose story is such a huge part of this book, didn't take anything like the path his parents mapped out, but eventually he found his own path, back to an early passion for journalism, and he's now living in British Columbia, where he's a well-known broadcaster, mentor, teacher of journalists, environmentalist, and documentarian. And I'm also delighted.
Want to beat this guy?
Yeah. And I'm also delighted that he is with us here tonight to talk with James about this extraordinary book. But before we get the talk going, George has something he very much wants to say.
Stuart?
Oh my God.
I'm here because a group of people saved my life. Valerie, David, thank you, Sandy, Anne, and my best friend Stuart. And they saved my life, and that's why I'm here.
Okay. I kind of told you this was no ordinary book launch. Oh, God. Okay, so we're going to awkwardly pass the baton, but we'll see how we can do here. So actually, George, I want to start with you, because without one simple gesture you made, the first time you talked at length with James about the impact of Sally on your lives, I don't really think this book would exist. And when James got up to leave after that first long conversation, in which he told you what he wanted to do and what he wanted you to do, you picked up an envelope and handed it to him to take away. And it was the last letter Sally had written to you before she died on August 13th, 1968, and a letter you had never been able to read. So I really want to know what you were thinking as James walked away with that letter in his hand.
You mean, what are you thinking? I left Eastern Canada in the mid-70s, moved west, reinvented myself, discovered journalism, and spent a career talking people into talking to me. And I enjoyed the challenge. It was an intellectual challenge. Find somebody, if it's in the news business, probably the worst crisis in your life. So will you talk to me in the worst crisis of your life? So having done that professionally, having taught it professionally, I then encountered a journalist who says, talk to me about the worst point in your life. And it's a good story. It's awful, but it's a good story. And I'm fascinated by a good story. And I was compelled by the notion that if I was dead honest, I would have an opportunity to be clean about stuff, to get it out, warts and all. And it's a good story. So I said, sure. Not quite like that.
All right. And to back up a bit, James, I know you already wanted to write this story, so why was this a book you needed to write?
Well...
In less than 400 pages.
Exactly.
Sorry.
The truth hurts. It was obviously incubating in me for a long time, and because the death of Sally had been such this remarkable, it was a trauma, but in this remarkable way, this uncanny dream predicting her death, and George was in love with her, and I was falling in love with her, and he dreamt of her death, and it's advanced, and he proposes marriage in August 12th, and she's dead within hours of this, fulfilling this dream, so it's such a powerful thing. Now, I didn't know about the dream until 1998.
Right.
So why didn't you tell me in 1968? The book would have been... No, that's why it was a slow incubation, that this powerful event. I would call George every 10 years because of our reunions of this Odyssey trip. So I called him in 78, and I called him in 88. And then 98, I guess, your life was more stabilized, and you felt free enough to tell me this, and I am, of course, blown away. And what I, of course, never forgotten is the next day you emailed me and you said, last night our conversation took me into some very dark places in my life, and I thank you for that. Yeah. Rather than saying, leave me alone. So you were opening a little door there, and so the seed was planted. Now, meanwhile, I was immersed in what disturbs our blood, so I sort of parked it. But even then, I was really hesitant because I know how profoundly it haunted George and myself to a lesser degree, but certainly affected me deeply too. And I had actually parked it to the point I didn't think I was going to do it. And it wasn't until 2008, the next reunion, and every 10 years, people on the trip were saying, so Fitz, when are you going to do the book on Sally? Because I was doing What Disturbs. And I very hesitantly approached George by email and said, we don't have to do this, you know. And George was honest as usual, but I remember you were thrown into a state of intense ambivalence. You know, yes, no, a book can heal, a book can re-traumatize, what am I going to do? And then this pivotal moment where he showed his email to his daughter Lily, who was 26 at the time, and who by coincidence was born on the same day as Sally, May 25th. And he said, Dad, you're a journalist and you expect people to open up to you, so what goes around comes around. And she gave you a bit of a little push there, and so he emailed back, I'm in. And that was in 2009. Almost 10 years ago, so that's the slow crawl to the finish line. You know.
Yeah. I guess I'm not quite sure how to ask this kind of question, and George, you can step out of this one in this frame and not address this at all, because James's need to understand is the driving force of this book. But where What Disturbs Our Blood was about fathers, and the way they let themselves and their sons down to the point of self-murder. Mothers and the way they love or fail to love their children is something this book comes back to again and again. And James, how conscious of that were you when you set off, that digging into Sally was digging into mothers?
Yes. No, yeah. It was a slow, gradual, deepening process, I think. George and I were, because he was telling me he wanted to be transparent and open book and let's go for this. So that meant being honest as we possibly could, you know, because George had been chasing lying politicians his whole life, and honesty and transparency was the ideal. So we ended up challenging each other in ways that I didn't anticipate either. And so over that 5-year period, hundreds of hours of talking, this is where it inexorably led me, certainly. And then discovering these remarkable parallels in our lives, that we both had, you know, beautiful, smart, educated women, but who weren't cut out to be mothers in the pre-feminist Toronto in the 50s and 60s, and frustrated with their husbands and investing themselves with their, eldest sons. And the dynamics are very, very similar. And I mean, I think my mother was more disturbed than George's mother, but
Your brother is here. Is he nodding?
But that's where I realized I just had to keep going, because as you say, then I realized, I think partway through, oh my God, this is a mother book, right? It's under all the Sally stuff underneath it is this because the first 2 books were father books, and this was a much harder book to write because of the primal nature of the mother, right? We come out of her body, and say, how close do I get, right? Right down to the infant-mother relationship, practically, you know. And so her inability, for her own reasons, and I had enormous empathy and sympathy for my mother growing up. I was trying to teach her to be a mother, and I saw her dilemma in some way, her Victorian past, and she was trying to break out of it in her own way. But the terrible thing was, what I finally had to wake up to was the reality that her was almost a kind of a, sad to say, emotional incest invested in me, to the point that she started to subtly or not so subtly try to undermine my romantic relationships. And Sally was sort of the first example of that. And George experienced this terrible phenomenon of you've been devastated, you come home and, you know, George walks into his parents and says, Sally is dead, and there's just a wall of nothingness that these World War II people, alcoholic people in Toronto, they can't respond emotionally, they just can't.
Right. And
it was the same with my parents. And this was another reason I was drawn to the story. I think once I understand these remarkable mirroring and paralleling, that this isn't just a one-off story, this is about a culture. And this phobia around grief and mourning and natural feelings and shocking. And so George in some ways was not echoing my father, of course, because my father was cracked up in a psychiatric institution and drugged and not allowed to talk out his feelings. And the same thing happened to George for 2 weeks. After the year after the event, for 2 weeks he was in Northridge, and they were doing the same thing to George. They're pathologizing his grief for his dead girlfriend.
Right.
he's not crazy, they're crazy.
Yeah.
And that really has to be confronted. And this is still going on. So this is a theme very close to my heart.
Yeah. And I want to also, the thing that is so, there's joy in this book as well as everything else that's going on in this book. And a lot of the joy is around Sally's voice, which, thanks to George sharing the letters, comes out brilliantly. But why did Sally cast such a long shadow? And I think that one has to go to George. If he can do it.
Who in here has read the book? Oh my God. Who's going to buy 6 for their family? And I have never come to terms with the fact that I actually had a dream that this was going to happen. I am the most devout, non-woo-woo person you'll ever meet. I'm convinced things don't happen for a reason, it's just shit happens. And I had this dream, and I knew this was going to happen. So I was possessed of a grief 6 months in advance. And attempted to share it, and everybody I attempted to share it with went, because it sounded like a mopey, lovesick, post-adolescent kid who's not dealing, and it might have been that, I don't know, but I had a dream. And so I've been haunted by that premonition of this since well before it happened. And I still am to some degree, so I've never come out of that to some degree. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is why 2 of you fell so much in love with Sally that 5 decades later you're still thinking about her.
Yeah. I think she wasn't like our mothers. She was not the archetypal porcelain private school, groomed hair. She was real. She swore and she drank and she smoked, and she had when I knew her, she was quite tomboyish.
Yeah.
And there was something, and her energy and her vitality, and she wasn't this classical beauty either. There was just something. I've often thought about this, that I think we were drawn to her for exactly the same reasons, almost. It's sort of like, that quality.
Right. And then there were the days and times you were living through where, it was possible for you both to imagine a life that wasn't just on the track your parents laid down for you. So how much of it was the loss of Sally, how much was it the times that kind of blew you up, took you out of the space you were destined to fulfill, and set you off?
I stood on the doorstep of her parents' house and knocked on the door with a telegram saying we're getting married. George Widows opened the door and said, "She's dead." And in that instant, I knew that the life that I was about to live no longer existed. And I had to find another path, and it took me years to do it, but I was rescued, I think, because I was going to be a well-heeled Bay Street lawyer of some sort. I was destined to drink because that's sort of genetic in my family, and I wouldn't have made it this far. But in that instant, I knew I had to find another path. Whatever I was doing, private school and all that stuff, and good table manners, the whole 9 yards, I knew it was done. And so I got to get out.
Yeah.
That's what so moved me about this story, that as I began to understand George better, and that there was sort of like the twin towers of life are love and work, right? I mean, and by the time he was 21, they had both been he'd been assassinated and shot down, a terrorist attack, because his parents, George wanted to be a journalist when he was 10.
Right.
And we're lucky if we can have that kind of bliss at that age. We know precisely, I want to be that guy on the radio. Right? I didn't have that at that age.
Me neither.
And his parents, for their own reasons, were no. It was like he was saying he wanted to be a drug dealer or something. And the school, the pairing of Upper Canada College and 4 generations of George, he's the 4th generation named George, from both sides of the family. It's remarkable. George. Oh, you're the seventh George, I think. So there's a remarkable implicit and explicit pressure to fulfill this upper Canadian role.
Right.
But then the 1960s show up. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as I really admired George because he had Stewart and he had public school friends, he had perspective.
Right.
And he bought out. He rebelled much earlier than I did. I was a good boy. I just kept my head down and not do what I'm told until I get out of here. But he had the courage in age 16 to finally confront his parents and say, why are you wasting money on sending me to a school that I hate?
Mm-hmm.
And the price he had to pay for this. And he wanted to go to journalism at Ryerson.
Yeah.
You know, this is like, I mean, it's shocking to think of this in 1964, but this is the way it was. And so, but he again pays his price. So that was a shock enough. But then the death of Sally coming right on the heels of this,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like your identity is erased almost, you know. As you say, it ultimately sets you on another path. But it nearly killed you, you know, in some sense, spiritually and physically. And so I was naturally very taken with this story because it's archetypal from the world that we come from. I mean, it's a first world problem, but it's a problem. And my father was driven mad by this. Mad. A very successful doctor because his father was a doctor, and there's no question that you must replicate. You can't surpass the father, but you must become a clone of and sell your soul and lose your true self. And they drink themselves to death or they do something to themselves. And middle-aged crack-ups, they're legendary. And no one will, to this day, still doesn't talk about them. The old boy book was full of them.
Yeah.
The school doesn't, mine don't exist, the book doesn't exist. There's never a conversation still. This is supposed to be the elite. These are supposed to be the leaders of the country. And if they're that cowardly in 2018, I mean, this is pathetic. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, so conversations. So George and I, so perhaps the book is an example to set.
Yeah.
We'll see how they react to this.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very interesting little cue you just gave me because I was completely shocked as one of the drafts came in and I was reading a little section saying that this book would be your last. I know, and you just kind of said that a lot of the attitudes that you've been unpacking are still here with us.
It's an ongoing.
Kind of destroying people.
That's right.
So why is Dreaming Sally your last?
I had an epiphany in the middle of the book that, again, writing for my mother, I wrote little stories for her when I was 6, but I didn't speak as a child. I was almost autistic for a while because of her disconnect. I was imploding on myself, and so I became over-invested in writing. This was an epiphany that I realized, and why writing was so onerous. I'm good at it, but I'm painstakingly, so that the toll it takes on me to do it, I'm good at it, but I'm getting to the point where it's just too difficult. And it's nice to have the rewards and everything, but then I realized that the developmental stage that I skipped was this. Like, my first book was oral history, which was an example, but I wanted people to talk to me before I could talk. I'd rather do this, right? This was this undeveloped part of my personality that plagued me for years. When I was in group therapy, I couldn't talk for 2 years. I was thrown back into my frozen childhood. And a lot of wonderful people helped me come out of that and literally find my actual physical voice. The writer's voice is another thing. That was hard one, doing what disturbs over 15 years.
Yeah.
I defined my voice. And by the end of that, I felt that I had. And then in 2010, when I started to do public speaking, which was used to terrify me, all of a sudden I'm in the front of a room like this, and all of a sudden I'm finding my voice. Because people are respectful and they're listening and they're seeing the power of what I'm saying, and it makes me feel real and it makes them feel real. And so this was a totally unexpected bonus from that process, right? And so this book is a continuation of this. That I mean, I'm really hoping that George and I go on the road and do a duet, you know, on the radio. because he's a broadcast journalist and I was a print journalist. And you see, it's like yin yang, you know.
This is like stand-up tragedy.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm not sure we can top that line. I mean, okay. You totally derailed what I was going to ask you next. I think maybe I was going to ask you if both of you are still Dreams Alley. If both of you still. I mean, I also feel like I should ask one question before we stop talking about how the heck the two of you navigated the storytelling involved here. The trust on your part, George,
Yes.
crazy. The giving over of control, nuts. And yet, here you are sitting together, presumably not actually hating each other. So, over to whomever.
We're working on it.
I stumbled through a variety of relationships, not as a very healthy person, until I found the perfect partner who suggested very clearly that it was a good thing in life to be honest all the time. And honestly, that was kind of it was a novel notion, because I grew up learning how to hide and how to be, I was charming. Like, I charmed other people's moms out of dinner for decades. So I learned how to be charming. I never learned how to be honest. So this was an opportunity to be honest about something that was, in my life, it was about as bad as anything could ever be, or has ever been. And so once I committed to being honest, it was, it never has gone away.
Yeah.
It's never gone away. Doing this with you has revisited it in novel and fascinating and horrifying ways. But you can either confront the crap that sits in your life, or you can try to walk around it. And I finally figured I would confront it, and then you were the opportunity that somebody sent me. So thanks, man.
Just recently, George said to me, you haven't made me a better person, but you've made me a more interesting person. But the toing and froing your question, this is what, the initial writing of it, I was almost imploring George, why don't you write a chapter, and I'll write a chapter, and I'll write an alternate chapter.
I said no.
Did you? I
did.
That. Oh, okay. Because when I
Needed a voice.
Because here's a professional, gifted communicator, you know, who has mastered the succinct news story, and it's natural to him now to express himself in images and metaphors. And so when I was talking to him, I was taking notes over the phone, and there was these wonderful phrases that were sort of evocative.
Stand-up tragedy.
Yeah. And I'm so stitching them all together in the George chapters where I'm writing about his life, and I'm writing it, but I'm trying. It's in my voice. Technically, I'm the writer, but I felt like I was sort of cultural appropriation, you know, because it's his language and his voice and his phrase making, and I would tell this him, so do I have your permission to do that? To sort of, and so we did, and so I guess it works. You know?
I think that maybe, I think that the joy of the book is in the reading of the book. And George and James are going to be here for a while to engage in conversation. And I know there's a reunion here, and there are people that George loves here, and I think I'm going to release them from sitting on the stage. But I also know that James has something you want to say to close it out, right?
Yeah, just yeah.
That you may notice there are some people wearing lapels with names on them, and they are this remarkable, maybe 25 of you out there, I guess, who are actual characters in the book. So they're in the room, but they're in the book. So feel free to mingle and chat with them, because you know they'll give you their version of reality, and I think they'd enjoy that. And I was going to say to George that the other image that came to me was sort of like, we've done our Irish best here in this whole process, which is ongoing, but sort of to turn a guilt trip into a love-in, you know, and that aspect. I mean, the tragedy is always there, but tonight this is what it feels like. Like the 60s was so much a powerful part of the story, and Sally in some way represented that spirit. And something that got killed in the 60s was killed in us, but then revitalizing it now. You know?
Thank you both.